Alexander Miller was convinced that attending his ex-fiancée's wedding would mark the absolute final chapter of a story he had never managed to fully close. What he did not realize was that everything would transform the exact moment a dark-haired stranger paused in front of the empty chair at table 12 and softly asked if the seat was taken. That simple question triggered a harmless lie, an unexpected sequence of twists, and a quiet truth that had been waiting too long to surface. Nobody at that gathering could have guessed that while one couple celebrated a brand new union, two individuals who had given up on romance were about to find a second chance. The late afternoon sun descended over Savannah, Georgia, casting a rich amber light across the historic brick walls and the gentle currents of the Savannah River. In the courtyard of a restored plantation house, guests raised their crystal glasses, filled with sparkling wine, while gentle acoustic guitar melodies drifted through the humid air. The delicious aroma of roasted pecans, freshly baked biscuits, and savory country ham filled the surroundings. Alexander Miller took a deep, steadying breath before stepping onto the lush estate grounds. For many agonizing weeks, he had debated whether he possessed the strength to face this evening. 2 whole years after their painful breakup, Isabella was marrying another man. In the end, Alexander realized that avoiding the past meant remaining trapped within its heavy shadow. He had not driven out to this ceremony to win her back, or to make a scene. He simply wanted to prove to himself that he was no longer the broken man he used to be. A polite host checked the velvet attendance roster and smiled warmly at him. "Welcome, Mr. Miller. Your assigned seating is at table 12. As Alexander navigated through the maze of tables decorated with white roses, glowing lanterns, and silk ribbons, he immediately understood why he had been placed in that exact spot. Table 12 was tucked into the furthest corner of the southern garden, far removed from the center dance floor and miles away from the bridal party. It looked like the designated corner for guests whom the organizers did not know how to categorize. Alexander allowed himself a small, ironic smirk, thinking that this was where the left-behind people belonged. 2 elderly women sitting across from him noticed his expression and let out gentle, kind laughs. One of them told him not to speak that way, adding that the most beautiful journeys in life always began at the forgotten tables. That unexpected remark brought a genuine smile to his face. He picked up a glass of sparkling water, sipping it while his eyes drifted toward the head table. There sat Isabella. She was glowing, laughing softly while greeting her well-wishers with grace. Alexander observed her for a brief moment, surprised to feel that the sharpness of his ancient grief had dulled completely. He felt neither anger nor longing. Instead, he recognized that a major chapter of his journey had finally closed. He glanced down at the worn leather watch surrounding his left wrist, a gift Isabella had given him 5 years ago. Once a symbol of heartbreak, it now simply kept track of the passing minutes. Suddenly, a soft voice broke his train of thought. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Alexander looked up to find a graceful woman, around 35 years of age, possessing dark brown hair and remarkably calm hazel eyes. She wore an elegant emerald green dress that contrasted beautifully with the white flowers surrounding them. She was pointing to the empty chair beside him. Alexander answered before his mind could filter the words, stating that he had been saving it just for her. The moment it left his mouth, he feared he had sounded foolish, but the woman offered a bright, genuine smile. She remarked that her timing was impeccable, taking a seat beside him while a waiter poured her a fresh drink. For a few quiet seconds, they both took in the vibrant scene around them. She was the one who broke the silence, remarking that they seemed to be sitting at the table of the forgotten. Alexander let out a low laugh, agreeing that he had harbored the exact same thought. She smiled warmly, suggesting that it was not such a terrible place to be, since nobody over here was forcing them to get up and dance just yet. They both shared a light laugh, and the initial awkwardness dissolved instantly. Raising her glass, she proposed a toast to Table 12 and to the reality that the best stories never start at the main table. Their glasses met with a clear, delicate chime. "I am Abigail," she said softly, extending her hand. "Alexander," he replied, taking her hand as twinkling fairy lights began to glow across the surrounding trees. The conversation between Alexander and Abigail unfolded with an effortless flow that caught them both off guard. They talked about the coastal breeze, the acoustic music, and how funny it was that the most isolated tables often turned out to be the most peaceful spots in the entire venue. Alexander found himself laughing more frequently than he had in months. After a short while, Abigail rested her chin on her hand, looking at him with gentle curiosity. She asked if she could pose a personal question, and Alexander gave a small nod of assent. She wondered out loud why someone who seemed so inherently kind carried such a heavy sadness in his eyes at a wedding. Alexander paused, taking a moment to gather his thoughts, before offering an answer filled with surprising calm. He explained that the bride happened to be the woman he once thought was the great love of his life. Abigail did not offer pity or awkward condolences. Instead, her eyes reflected deep understanding. Alexander offered a small, self-deprecating smile, admitting that choosing to spend a Saturday evening at his ex-fiancée's wedding was probably a questionable decision. Abigail set her glass down and looked directly into his eyes, stating firmly that tonight they would make sure neither of them had to sit in solitude. Alexander felt those words settle deep within his chest, carrying far more weight than any well-meaning advice he had received over the past 2 years. Without realizing it, he stopped feeling like an unwanted guest in the back corner because someone had willingly chosen to occupy the empty chair beside him. The evening breeze off the river grew cooler as dusk settled over Savannah. Waiters began serving the main courses, and the courtyard buzzed with joyful chatter. At table 12, however, the atmosphere remained uniquely tranquil. Away from the loud toasts, their dialogue possessed a comfortable intimacy. Abigail leaned in slightly and whispered that she felt like people were beginning to stare at them. Alexander discreetly glanced around the garden and realized she was entirely correct. A few curious eyes were indeed turned toward their corner. Among them was Mrs. Evelyn, Isabella's mother, who was squinting slightly as if trying to recall who the elegant woman sitting next to her daughter's former partner could be. Alexander let out a quiet sigh, noting that it would not be long before people started asking awkward questions. Abigail rested her elbows on the tablecloth, asking if that prospect bothered him. When he admitted it made him a bit uneasy, a mischievous glint appeared in her eyes. She announced that she had a sudden idea. Alexander raised an eyebrow, playfully asking if he ought to be concerned. Abigail chuckled softly, replying that he should only be a little concerned. "I'm listening," Alexander said, amusement lacing his tone. She suggested that they simply pretend they had arrived at the celebration together as a couple. Alexander blinked in sheer disbelief, asking her to repeat herself. She clarified that it would only be for this single evening, but Alexander shook his head with a grin, declaring it sounded like a recipe for disaster. Abigail countered that terrible ideas were usually the ones that worked out best. Alexander could not suppress his laughter. It had been ages since a conversation felt this light and unburdened. He agreed to the charade, asking how they were supposed to claim they met. Abigail scanned the garden for inspiration, until her gaze landed on a hand-carved wooden display near the entrance. She smiled brightly, suggesting that she had brought a vintage chair to his workshop for restoration. Alexander stared at her in genuine astonishment, asking how she knew what he did for a living. Abigail reminded him that he had mentioned his furniture restoration business just 10 minutes ago. She laughed, pointing out that their fictional backstory was already grounded in reality. During the next few minutes, they playfully embellished the tale, deciding that the chair had belonged to Abigail's grandmother, that Alexander had taken 3 full weeks to carefully restore the oak frame, and that she had visited his workshop so many times that they ended up sharing countless cups of coffee. The story sounded so natural that even they began to forget it was completely made up. Right on cue, the 2 elderly women sitting across from them leaned forward with wide smiles. One of them apologized for being nosy before asking how long the 2 of them had been dating. Alexander opened his mouth to explain, but Abigail answered seamlessly, stating it had been nearly a full year. The woman asked who had made the first move, and Abigail claimed Alexander had, though she jokingly added that it took him 3 coffee dates just to build up the courage to ask her out. The 2 older women laughed heartily, remarking that men always took far too long. Alexander decided to jump right into the performance, adding with a grin that he wanted to be entirely certain she would not reject him. "And here we are," Abigail concluded, sharing a warm, conspiratorial glance with him that made his heart beat just a little faster. For the first time since stepping foot onto the plantation grounds, Alexander completely stopped dwelling on Isabella. He was entirely anchored in the present moment, enjoying the unexpected spark of warmth. However, their peaceful bubble was soon approached by Mrs. Evelyn. The older woman walked over with slow, deliberate elegance, her tailored dress matching her graceful demeanor. She stopped at table 12, smiling down at Alexander with genuine affection. "Alexander, my dear, it is so wonderful to see you tonight," she said smoothly. Alexander stood up politely, wishing her a good evening. Mrs. Evelyn's gaze then shifted to Abigail, her expression turning politely inquisitive. She noted that she had not yet had the pleasure of being introduced. Abigail stood up gracefully, extending her hand with complete composure, and introducing herself as Abigail Nelson. Mrs. Evelyn shook her hand, asking in a tone of pure, motherly curiosity how she and Alexander had come to meet. Alexander felt a knot tighten in his stomach, anticipating an awkward slip-up. Abigail, however, did not hesitate for a single second. She explained with absolute poise that she had brought a treasured antique rocking chair from her grandmother to Alexander's restoration shop, and that he had miraculously brought the damaged piece back to life. Mrs. Evelyn smiled softly, looking back at Alexander and noting that he had always possessed an extraordinary amount of patience for taking care of things that truly mattered. Alexander met her gaze with quiet dignity, replying that he always tried his best to preserve items that were still capable of being mended. Those words caused Abigail to glance at him with a tender, lingering expression. Mrs. Evelyn nodded approvingly, expressing how genuinely happy she was to see Alexander in such wonderful company, before wishing them a delightful evening. As soon as she walked away toward the main pavilion, both Alexander and Abigail let out a long, synchronized breath of relief. "You were absolutely incredible," Alexander whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. Abigail grinned back, replying that he had not done too poorly himself. They shared a soft laugh, completely forgetting for a moment that their bond had begun as a playful deception. The string lights stretched across the oak trees cast a magical glow over the courtyard, illuminating the scene as gentle jazz music filled the air. Alexander observed Abigail in silence. She had walked into his life less than an hour ago, yet she had somehow managed to lighten a burden he had carried for 2 whole years. Gathering his courage, Alexander asked her why she was going through all this trouble for a complete stranger. Abigail remained silent for a few seconds, her eyes dropping down to her glass as a fleeting shadow of sorrow crossed her features. She quietly answered that she knew all too well how painful it felt to watch everyone else pair up while sitting alone. Alexander did not offer a verbal response. None was needed. For the first time, he recognized that beneath Abigail's vibrant laughter lay her own hidden wounds, waiting for a safe moment to be revealed. As dinner progressed with lively toasts and the clinking of glasses, a couple moved to the center of the patio to dance. From table 12, Alexander watched the dancers, casually mentioning that he had not danced in years. Abigail smirked, noting that meant he was either due for a wonderful surprise or about to make a complete fool of himself. They both laughed, and Abigail stood up, extending her hand toward him. She urged him to join her, but Alexander hesitated, warning her that he could not promise any impressive moves. Abigail laughed softly, replying that she could not promise any either, which made the whole thing far less intimidating. Accepting her hand, Alexander allowed her to lead him onto the wooden floor. Their initial steps were admittedly clumsy, and Alexander accidentally stepped on the hem of her emerald dress within the first 30 seconds. He apologized profusely, but Abigail merely laughed it off, declaring that her dress would survive the night. Her light-hearted attitude allowed Alexander to relax completely. They stopped worrying about step accuracy and simply moved together in rhythm with the music. It was far from a flawless performance, but it was remarkably genuine. When the song ended, they strolled back to their quiet table, while a cool September breeze rustled through the surrounding cypress trees. Abigail rested her hands on the back of her chair, looking out over the illuminated riverbank. She asked if she could share a confession with him. Alexander nodded attentively, and she revealed that 3 weeks ago, she was supposed to be walking down the aisle at her own wedding. Alexander looked at her in surprise, asking what had happened. Abigail swallowed hard, explaining that just 7 days before the big day, her fiancé confessed he was no longer certain he wanted to build a future with her. Alexander lowered his head, expressing his deep sympathy. Abigail offered a brave, sad smile, admitting that for days afterward, she believed the failure was entirely her fault, convincing herself she was simply not enough. Alexander took a deep breath, recognizing those exact feelings of inadequacy. He confessed that he had experienced the exact same thoughts when Isabella ended their engagement. He shared that losing her was not the only thing that hurt. The deepest wound came from feeling as though he was no longer enough for someone who knew every single one of his strengths and flaws. He admitted that the absolute hardest part was convincing himself that no one would ever choose him again. Abigail listened in complete, empathetic silence, absorbing every word. Alexander smiled softly, remarking that it seemed both of them had spent far too much time believing the exact same lie. Abigail looked up, her hazel eyes softening as she agreed. Just then, a waiter placed 2 slices of warm pecan pie onto their table. Abigail took a small bite, praising the rich flavor. Alexander chuckled, remembering that his mother used to say, "No dessert could ever fix a broken heart." Abigail teased him, asking if his mother was right, but Alexander shook his head gently. He stated that dessert alone could not fix it, but sharing it with the right person certainly helped. Abigail let out a soft, delighted laugh, telling him that sounded far more romantic than he probably intended. They continued talking for nearly an hour, covering every topic imaginable, from Alexander's woodworking shop to Abigail's small floral design business, from the hard lessons learned in their 20s to the travel destinations they still hoped to explore. Time slipped away so quickly that Alexander completely lost track of his surroundings. When he happened to look over toward the head table, he noticed something that made him freeze in realization. He had not looked in Isabella's direction for over an hour. Even more astounding was the fact that he had not missed her at all. For the first time in 24 months, she was no longer the center of his emotional world. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted when the event host picked up a microphone near the front platform. The host announced that it was time for short toasts from the guests, adding that each table was invited to send up a representative to say a few words. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. The 2 elderly women at table 12 immediately turned and pointed directly at Alexander, insisting that he should be the one to speak for their table. Alexander's eyes widened in sheer panic, and he hurriedly protested that he could not possibly do that. Abigail smiled calmly, telling him that he absolutely could. Alexander insisted he had not prepared a single sentence, but Abigail reassured him that preparation was unnecessary. He worried out loud that he would embarrass himself, but she shook her head gently, advising him to simply speak from his heart, the same way he had been talking to her all evening. Alexander took a deep, steadying breath. For the first time all night, he was not afraid of speaking in front of Isabella. He was only afraid of failing to express the genuine gratitude filling his chest. The host's voice boomed over the speakers, calling on table 12. All eyes turned toward the back corner. Alexander rose slowly from his seat, adjusting his jacket as he made his way toward the front of the courtyard. Alexander walked deliberately toward the small microphone setup, while the crowd fell into an expectant hush. He had always disliked public speaking, especially under circumstances as emotionally complex as these. The host handed him the microphone with an encouraging nod. For a few agonizing seconds, Alexander stood completely silent, holding the warm metal in his hand. He looked toward the main table where Isabella sat next to her new husband, Oliver. They looked truly happy together, and to his immense relief, seeing them like that no longer caused a single pang of pain in his chest. Then, Alexander turned his gaze toward the far corner of the garden. His eyes locked onto Abigail. She gave him a gentle, reassuring nod, reminding him without words that he was not standing up there alone. Alexander cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice surprisingly steady. "First, I want to extend my heartfelt congratulations to Isabella and Oliver." A polite round of applause filled the open air. Alexander waited for it to subside before continuing with a thoughtful smile. He admitted that when he first received the invitation to this wedding, he assumed it would be one of the most difficult evenings of his life. He confessed that he believed he was coming here to say a final, painful goodbye to a chapter of his past. But tonight, he had discovered he was completely mistaken. The courtyard grew completely still as guests leaned in to listen. Alexander glanced around the beautifully decorated lawn, admitting that when he first sat down at table 12, he felt like he had been assigned to the table meant for people who no longer fit anywhere else. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the audience, and the two elderly women at his table nodded in agreement with bright grins. But as the evening unfolded, Alexander continued, I realized something important. Sometimes the best table in the room isn't the one closest to the stage. It's the table where life quietly places the person you were meant to meet. Alexander's gaze drifted directly back to Abigail. Though he was standing in front of dozens of strangers, his words were meant entirely for her. He spoke about how every person carries an empty chair inside their heart, often guarding it for years in the hope that someone from the past will return to fill it. But perhaps, he suggested, that chair was never meant for who used to be there. Perhaps it was simply waiting for the right person to arrive. Abigail bit her lower lip, her eyes shining with unshed tears, as a soft, touched smile spread across her face. Alexander's voice grew even stronger as he explained his profession as an antique restorer. He shared how people frequently brought broken, cracked, and weathered pieces of furniture into his shop, items that others considered worthless. Yet, with patience and care, those exact pieces could be restored to a beauty far greater than when they were brand new. He paused, letting the silence settle over the garden, before stating that human beings were no different. No one loses their worth simply because life has left them with a few scars. A profound quiet fell over the entire audience. Guests stopped sipping their drinks, completely captivated by the sincerity of his words. Alexander concluded by saying that he had not only come tonight to celebrate a new beginning for two people, but also to discover that his own life was far from over. He offered one final warm smile to the bride and groom, wishing them genuine happiness, before handing the microphone back to the host. For a brief second, there was total silence. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap from table 12, followed immediately by a thunderous ovation that swept through the entire courtyard. Guests stood up from their chairs, moved by the sheer authenticity of his speech. Alexander stepped down from the platform and walked back through the crowd toward his table, where Abigail was waiting for him. When he reached her, she whispered softly that his speech definitely was not part of their fake backstory. Alexander smiled warmly, replying that he thought they had stopped making things up a long time ago. They stood near the edge of the garden in comfortable silence, their bond shifting into something real and profound. A moment later, the host announced that it was time for the traditional bouquet toss. Cheerful music erupted from the speakers, and dozens of single women gathered near the dance floor, while Isabella stepped forward, holding a vibrant bouquet of wildflowers. Abigail watched the commotion from a distance with an amused smile. Alexander glanced at her, asking if she was going to join the group. Abigail laughed softly, stating that she had already made too many wedding plans for one lifetime and was perfectly content watching from the sidelines. Alexander nodded in understanding. The crowd began a lively countdown. 3, 2, 1! Isabella tossed the bouquet high into the night air. The flowers arced over the heads of the crowd, bouncing off several outstretched hands before flying across the lawn and landing squarely in Abigail's open arms. Abigail stared down at the colorful flowers in total shock, muttering in disbelief that the bouquet must have picked the wrong person. The entire crowd burst into cheerful laughter, and the elderly women at table 12 clapped their hands in delight, shouting that it was a sign of good luck. Mrs. Evelyn stepped forward once again, a polite smile on her face, as she remarked that luck seemed to have taken a special interest in table 12 tonight. A few nearby guests chuckled politely. Mrs. Evelyn added that she hoped life would continue to give them both reasons to celebrate together as a couple. Though her words were well-intentioned, the assumption placed an immediate, uncomfortable spotlight back on Alexander and Abigail. Alexander took a step forward, intending to clarify the situation, but Abigail gently placed a hand on his arm, silently asking him to let her handle it. Taking a deep breath, Abigail faced the gathering of guests. The surrounding chatter died down, and even the background music seemed to fade into quietness. She announced clearly that it was time to share the truth, explaining that she and Alexander were not actually a couple. A surprised murmur swept through the crowd, and Mrs. Evelyn watched her intently without interrupting. Abigail explained that they had only met a few hours ago right here at the reception. She shared how she had found an empty chair at table 12 and asked if it was available, and how Alexander had kindly replied that he had been saving it for her. She smiled warmly as she recalled the moment, explaining that both of them were feeling lonely and out of place, so they had playfully invented a fake story about a restored rocking chair and shared coffee dates to get through the evening. A few guests broke into appreciative smiles, and the two older women at table 12 let out delighted giggles. Abigail's expression then turned serious and deeply sincere as she looked toward Alexander. She confessed that while the backstory was fictional, everything else about their interaction was completely genuine. She spoke of how attentively he had listened to her, how respectfully he had treated her, and how he had made her feel safe and valued during a night when she expected to feel completely invisible. She admitted that just 3 weeks ago, she believed no one would ever choose her again. But tonight, she had learned that the most important thing was not simply being chosen. It was finding someone who treated you with absolute grace and kindness. The brief silence that followed her confession was instantly broken by warm applause. The crowd was not judging a harmless lie. They were applauding an undeniable human truth. Alexander walked up to Abigail without saying a word, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and gently placed it over her shoulders to shield her from the cooling night air. Abigail looked up into his eyes, whispering a soft thank you, and Alexander smiled back, telling her he just wanted to make sure she stayed warm. Standing a short distance away, Isabella had watched the entire interaction with tears welling in her eyes. She remembered the compassionate man she had loved years ago, realizing that he had never lost his kind heart. He had simply needed an opportunity to believe in himself again. Waiting for the applause to die down, Isabella walked over to where Alexander and Abigail were standing. She paused in front of Alexander, her expression peaceful yet carrying the weight of an unclosed chapter. She asked if they could speak privately for a moment before he departed. Alexander looked at her calmly before giving a single nod of agreement, knowing this conversation was 2 years overdue. Alexander followed Isabella to a quiet brick balcony overlooking the Savannah River, where the dark water reflected the distant city lights. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Isabella finally broke the silence, thanking him sincerely for coming tonight. Alexander offered a gentle smile, admitting that he had almost backed out at the last minute. Isabella looked down at her hands, confessing that when she was putting the guest list together, she hesitated for days before sending his invitation because she felt she owed him an apology. She added that she was the one who specifically asked the organizers to seat him at table 12, assuming it would spare everyone from potential awkwardness. She looked up at him with remorseful eyes, apologizing for putting him in the back corner. Alexander looked out over the glowing river and smiled peacefully. He told her that if she had placed him anywhere else, he never would have met Abigail. Isabella let out a soft, emotional laugh, tears spilling down her cheeks, as she remarked that he had always been a far better person than she deserved. Alexander shook his head gently, explaining that neither of them was the villain in the story. They were simply two people who wanted different things from life. Isabella nodded, feeling a massive weight of guilt lift from her heart. They shared a brief, meaningful embrace, a final, peaceful goodbye, free of lingering bitterness or regret. When Alexander returned to the front entrance of the plantation venue, he found Abigail waiting near the grand driveway. She was still wearing his suit jacket over her emerald dress, her face lighting up with a soft smile as soon as she saw him approaching. She asked if everything was all right, and Alexander nodded, replying that he had finally closed a door that had been left open for far too long. Abigail's smile widened as she suggested that meant he was finally ready to open a new one. They walked out through the wrought iron gates together into the quiet night. The cobblestone streets of Savannah were serene, wrapped in the cool night air. They strolled slowly down the sidewalk toward a wooden park bench under a massive oak tree while waiting for Abigail's ride to arrive. Abigail pointed to the empty space on the bench, jokingly asking if the seat was taken. Alexander looked at her with genuine warmth, replying that it now had her name on it. Abigail laughed aloud, admitting she loved that answer. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the streetlights flicker against the moss-draped trees. The silence was no longer heavy or awkward. It was the peaceful calm of two people who no longer needed endless words to feel connected. In the distance, a church bell struck 11 times. A yellow taxi pulled up to the curb a few yards away. Abigail turned to face Alexander, mentioning that she had to drive back to Atlanta tomorrow afternoon, but she asked if he would be willing to get breakfast with her at 9 o'clock in the morning. Alexander smiled brightly, replying that he would love nothing more. Abigail stepped toward the open car door, but before getting in, she looked back at him one last time, stating how glad she was that she had stumbled upon that empty chair at table 12. Alexander looked into her eyes and replied that he felt the exact same way. Abigail got into the car, giving him a warm wave as the vehicle pulled away into the night. Alexander stood on the sidewalk, watching the taillights fade into the distance. Only then did he look down at the old leather watch on his wrist. For 2 agonizing years, that watch had served as a silent reminder of a failed relationship. Tonight, for the very first time, he no longer saw it as a mark of past pain. It was simply measuring the hours left until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, when he would see Abigail again. He smiled, not because of the time displayed on the dial, but because he had finally stopped counting the days he had lost and started looking forward to the days yet to come. As he walked toward his parked car, Alexander understood that the most meaningful people often enter our lives when we least expect them. They do not arrive to erase our past, but to remind us that our future still holds limitless room for joy. And it had all begun with one simple question. Life has a fascinating, unpredictable way of dismantling our carefully constructed plans only to rebuild something far more resilient in their place. When we experience a devastating heartbreak or a profound disappointment, our immediate instinct is often to retreat, to build emotional walls, and to assume that our best days are behind us. We convince ourselves that the empty chairs in our lives represent permanent loss rather than open potential. Yet, as Alexander and Abigail discovered amidst the shadows of Table 12, an ending is rarely the final verdict on our capacity for happiness. More often than not, it is merely the quiet space required for a new story to begin. True healing does not demand that we erase our scars or pretend our past struggles never occurred. Instead, it asks us to look at those experiences with grace, recognizing that every trial we have survived has contributed to the depth of our character. Alexander's work as a craftsman restored broken wood, but his time spent with Abigail restored his belief in genuine human connection. Kindness, patience, and vulnerability are not weaknesses to be discarded after a setback. They are the exact qualities that allow us to build a meaningful life with someone new. When we possess the courage to step into uncomfortable situations with an open heart, we create the possibility for extraordinary coincidences to unfold. It is profoundly comforting to realize that we do not need to have all the answers to move forward. We do not need a perfect past or a flawless plan for tomorrow. All that is required is the willingness to sit down at the table life has assigned to us, to listen to the people placed in our path, and to offer sincere goodwill to those around us. The most transformative moments in human existence rarely happen on grand stages under bright spotlights. They occur in quiet corners, through shared laughs over simple meals, and in the brave decision to trust another person with our true story. As the years accumulate, the truest measure of a life well lived is found in our capacity to love again after being hurt, to extend forgiveness to those who could not stay, and to remain hopeful even when the night feels long. Hope is not a passive wish, it is an active choice to keep an empty chair ready for whatever goodness lies ahead. No matter how isolated or forgotten you may feel in your current circumstances, remember that your story is still being written. The world is full of second chances, unexpected encounters, and new beginnings waiting for the simple courage of a welcoming smile.